for the other infrastructures. So, for example, here the exciting things in urban technology and infrastructure are really about the use of widespread sensing and networked information to control things like water and traffic, or maybe things like surveillance, and all of this runs on top of the internet. So the internet was itself at the top, and now it's at the bottom, where it is the substrate that the other infrastructures depend on. For example, there's a water tower near me that I can almost see from that window. And the big movement in water management is to add network connectivity to water towers so that they can report their level, and the sensor can express their situation. So I think it's fascinating that such an old infrastructure is now depending on what was new. So it's a reversal of what was old is new and new is old. And then I like the idea of the infrastructure because I feel like there is a desire among capital to copy the way that the internet works, and sometimes this is fetishized as calling the internet dynamic or adaptive, even though it is not particularly. But the idea that it's plastic, and that it's the idea of the network structure is obviously central to all infrastructure, including as I said, roads and water and things of that sort. But now they believe that the future of all systems is like an internet system. So anyway, I guess it's a good time to be in internet studies.
Thank you. Probably one last question then is just very, very close to what you have told now. I remember your article about people playing with the internet, which I like very much.
I'm so happy that you found that article. I also remember it fondly.
Good. And what is interesting there, maybe what was my angle of reading it, is the idea of meeting two understandings of what is the internet, from people who use it and people who create some digital divide programs, etc. And here, when you talk about, for example, comparison with water infrastructure, I wonder what, because it is rather clear what people try to control when they control water. And when they, let's say, control internet, I mean, all of them, just users or people who are in in Facebook, or people who are developing their cities. I mean, the mayor and some city ministry, so on. Their understandings of what they develop or control are different. And that is also, we have have a research about this, about the difference of understandings of what is the internet. So I wonder whether you probably had thought or seen in your research some conflicts or clashes of different understandings of the infrastructure, and the conflicts or controversies, which might be helpful to understand where is the conflict, inspiration, and a question also to understand who is left out, or I mean to find that turn to the research.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the way that I think about this sometimes is that in a way, the problem of media policy is the same as the problem of internet policy, because in media policy, it might be a very popular media policy for a government official or a politician to say, I will give you 100% more glamorous movie stars, or I will have, the action movies will be 2 times as fun, under my watch. But we don't have proposals like that, not because those things aren't desirable, but because there are certain objects of policy that are seen as acceptable, and there are norms of discourse that restrict what it is acceptable to talk about in a policy context. And so and the aim of government in some way is supposed to be narrow. It's supposed to be narrow in the sense that it doesn't necessarily, even though it does extend to everything in our lives, it purports to be something that is more specific to instrumental value. And it's hard sometimes to quantify the media with instrumental value. So I think the problem with the internet is a similar problem. We shouldn't be surprised that the understandings people have for technology on the ground or in everyday contexts is so different, because it's always going to be different than the political discourse or the policy discourse, because they're just different discourses and they are meant to do different things. So that will forever be the case. It will always be the case, perhaps, that there are these two discourses that do different things. It is useful to think about the other discourses, though. And I think one reason it's useful to think about them isn't that one of them is more real than the other. They're both real. So sometimes people say, well, policy says this, but we should study what's really going on. But that's not fair, because policy is just as real. It's just a different discourse. But I think the value in contrasting them, in part, is that the contrast shows up some assumptions that we didn't know we had about what was valuable. So the internet, for example, is loaded with all these other meanings. It has connotations, and so and they're very local. So in some countries, the internet means economic development. In other countries, it means parity. In other countries, it means access to financial markets. In some ways, the government policy is about taking something and filtering it through the restrictive lens of policy discourse, so that you may actually want a lot of different things to happen, but policy only allows you to talk about certain things. And so you may actually want things like, to ensure that only the appropriate kinds of communication occur, and you don't want people talking about forbidden things, but maybe that's not a useful object of policy in that discourse. So instead you speak about economic development. So I think the point of contrasting the discourses is to highlight the differences between them and then sort of reveal their assumptions. In that study, I think it comes through in the writing, I hope. In that study, the thing I was surprised about was the degree to which the policy discourses appeared in the everyday, because it seemed to me like, why would children or parents in a library care about esoteric policy discourses, but they often refer to them? And I think that's because in some way, when a technology is new, we search for ways to understand it, and the broader discussion about it is maybe more important than it would be with something that is settled and old, where we don't have to search for an understanding. So in that study, the question that people had really was, they said that it was about how would people use the internet to obtain information in a public library. But really the question they had, I think, was, what is the internet? And so maybe they drew from policy and political discourse because that's the discourse they had. They were looking for any discourse. They also probably drew from corporate advertisements about the internet and things like that to make sense of what was happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's quite interesting, and sorry, I hear myself. We have seen very interesting examples. I'm still eager to go on researching about